Welcome back. In this volume, we'll be talking about mutability and immutability. We'll start by talking about the Scala philosophy regarding pervasive types and immutability. Then we'll talk about some of the advantages and some of the dangers of mutability itself. Then we'll talk about streams, which are in a sense both mutable and immutable at the same time. And lastly, we'll talk about using mutability versus immutability and making decisions between them in practice. In our first section, we're going to talk about the Scala philosophy of pervasive types and immutability. We'll start by talking about the philosophy of typing, then we'll talk about some common patterns in typing, how to recognize certain type problems, and finally, we'll very briefly discuss keeping side effects as centralized as possible. Let's get started. First off, Scala's philosophy of pervasive typing really comes down to one simple thing. You want your types to represent as much as possible about what your function is doing and about what your value is capturing. So for example, if I have a value 3, it's an integer. If I put it in a variable called my number, that number's type is an integer. The type integer only tells us that this number can be anything between the minimum integer or the maximum integer. Now, this by itself is enough for us to understand what possible values this variable can take. And when, for example, we're testing or writing code around it, we can understand exactly what the parameters are of how it will behave. Let's say I have a function instead, build number, and it returns an int as well. And for now, it's defined as returning 3. If I just look at the function declaration, all I know is if I call build number, I'll get an int out. I don't know that I'll always get a 3 out, I just know I will get something in that same int range. So as the person calling that function, I need to be prepared to deal with any int. And then if the documentation tells me that it will always produce 3, I can deal with any other value as just an error. Now, types can get very, very specific for us if we want them to. Scala's type system is very powerful, and it has ways to represent a lot of different things. We're not going to get into a lot of these significantly more complicated ways that you can use the type system in this video, but you can look at libraries like Shapeless and Cats, all of which really get into some of the subtler and more powerful abilities that the type system has to let you more deeply represent your software's data flow through your types. Let's say we wanted to build a version of build number that could only return 3. Well, there's no way in types right now for us to define a value that is only 3. So the only thing that we could do is define our own type, say a case object 3, and have it come with a toInt that returns 3. Now I could define build number as something that will return 3 and have it always return 3. And in fact, we can't do this directly because this is a case object, and so we can't use it directly as a return type. But we can let Scala infer it for us. So this is one of the cases where building your own type hierarchy, especially with case classes and case objects, is very useful. It lets you very specifically limit the scope of things that your function can return. Now there's another possibility when you're returning objects, and that is that you could return null. Because of Java's type system, which sort of underpins Scala's type system, this is possible from any function. So in Scala, what we try to do is signal to the caller that you could have to deal with something that doesn't exist by using the option class. So if I defined build number as returning an option int and always return to sum 3, I've added to the list of things that you need to worry about when you call build number. I've told you that not only could you get a sum that contains any integer, but you could also get a none. And so as the caller, you have to figure out how you want to deal with what happens when you call build number and you don't get a number back. If you want a good example of this, if you had some sort of random number generator that was cryptographically secure, and this random number generator wanted to fail if it didn't have enough entropy to produce a properly random number, it could return none. And then you might have to call it again, or you might have to show an error to the user to say that you couldn't get enough entropy. All of these things are not guarantees. They're not situations that you'd necessarily deal with if you just returned an int. By returning an option of int, we know as the caller that we have to deal with those. So again, the core goal is always letting the caller understand what can happen inside the function, and most importantly, what will come back from the function based on the function signature, and then decide if you want to deal with it or not. So for example, let's say I wanted to do a do addition, and I wanted to call build number twice. We'll just assign these into variables. Number 1, build number, number 2, build number, and then I wanted to add these. Well, I can't just do number 1 plus number 2 because this is an option int. So how about if we use a for comprehension to unpack these? N1 gets, or really number 1 gets build number, number 2 gets build number, and then we yield number 1 plus number 2. And then we can get rid of these guys. Now the interesting thing about this is we have not dealt with the option, really. We've just passed it on. If I run do addition, I get back an option int still. So we've basically taken the return type of build number, which could include a none, and then passed that limitation, that additional possibility, to the caller of do addition as well. So if we were to define the type of do addition here, it would be an option int. Now, we could deal with this differently. If we didn't want to pass on that, that uncertainty, if you will, we could define a do addition to return an int, and then we could call build number twice and do a pattern match. And if we get a sum and a sum, then we'd add both of them, and otherwise we might return 0. So just like that, do addition now will always return a number. And if we tweaked build number to return a none in certain cases, then do addition would return a 0. So we have two options whenever we see one of these additional variations to deal with. We can either handle them directly in our function, or we can pass that question mark, if you will, that additional thing to deal with, to whoever our caller is. So that's returning null. There's another problem that's not unusual to find, which is that you want to write a function that wraps another function. So let's say I wanted to time how long it takes to run do addition. I might want to write, okay, timer, and then let's say that I just wanted to take a function. What do I do with the return type here? How do I make sure that I can return whatever the function that we're calling returns? Well, here we can say, okay, this function returns an int, and I'm going to return an int. And now I'm going to deal with checking the current system time. So system.current time nanos, I believe, is the call, and then I'm going to call the function, stash that return value in here. T2 is system.current time nanos, and we will return, well, actually first we'll print line T2 minus T1, and then we will return the ret val. So system.currentTime nanos isn't current time millis. All right, very good. We'll make that tweak. And then once we're here, we now have timer build addition. Let's start with build number first. We get an immediate type mismatch, right? Because we can't call that. And if we come up here, we'll do addition. That one still doesn't work because we want it to be a function. So we make it a function. Good, all right, that worked. But I can't do this on build number because build number has a different type, right? It returns an option int, we wanted an int. What we can do is define this with a type parameter. Say this timer has some type parameter t, and whatever that type is, when we fill it in, it's the return type of this function, and it's also the return type of the timer function. Now, if I come up here and run it on build number, it'll work and it'll return an option int. If I call it on do addition, again, it'll work, and this time the return value is an int. So you can define wrapper functions whose return type adapts to some of the parameters that are passed to it. So that's how to deal with that issue. And then the last issue that is fairly common is dealing with collections that have different subtypes. So for example, let's say that we had a trait animal, and we had a case class or a case object dog that is an animal, and we had a case object cat that is an animal, and we had a trait farm animal that extends animal, and then we had a case object, let's say cow, that extends farm animal, and a case object horse that extends farm animal. So we've got this little hierarchy, and then we create a list that contains dog, cat, cow, and horse. Now the type of this ends up being weird little type over here, but we can define it as my animals is a list of animal. Now if we tried to define this as a list of farm animal, that wouldn't work, right? Dog and cat are not farm animals. So it's a list of animals, but let's say that I had this list of animals and I only wanted to do something with the farm animals. So this is another common thing that comes up when you try to keep your types everywhere, is sometimes you lose a little bit of fidelity. And so you find yourself in a situation where you are dealing with a collection that returns a certain supertype, a parent type, but you want to deal with a specific subtype or a group of specific subtypes. And the trick there is always to use the collect function. The collect function, as we've covered before, does a pattern match. Anything that matches the pattern gets returned, anything that doesn't, doesn't. And more importantly, the return type of the collect function is based on only the things that match. So if we say collect all farm animals and don't change them, oops, my animals, then our end result is a list of farm animal now, not a list of animal. So this is a great way to specialize. So those are sort of three of the common type problems that you can run into, dealing with nulls, dealing with wrapper functions, and dealing with collections that are tied to a supertype when you're interested in a subtype. The last note I'll make, which is not something I'll write any example code about because it can be kind of hard to demonstrate in a small setting, is making sure to have your side effects centralized as much as possible. So Scala gives you all these tools to make immutable, or to deal with immutable functions, to deal with immutable data types, to deal with functions whose contents are immutable. But one thing that is easy to have happen is that you can write functions that have side effects that you don't think about. So for example, every time you write a function that prints, that's a side effect. If you're using a logging framework, every time you log a message, that's a side effect. So one thing that is very nice, if you can manage it, is trying to think about how to pull those side effects out of the individual pieces, the individual functions, and how to have a lot of functions that do work on immutable structures, that take in parameters that spit out return values but don't change any of the system state, and then tie them all together with a sort of top-level function that deals with any of the side effects, things like logging, things like printing stuff out, things like reading from the file system, and more importantly, writing to the file system, centralizing those all up in a coordinator function or class that mostly works with well-tested, easy-to-deal-with, immutable functions. And that wraps up the Scala philosophy of typing.